Hello everyone, I hope everybody's doing well. So I will have a series of videos for you guys uh, to talk about different things that are essential for you to complete your term project. The code that we will be developing, I will actually have it on GitHub. I will provide you with a link for at the end of the video. And essentially from now on, you're going to see different branches. If you're familiar what branches is for GitHub, to kind of see how the process is just going to gradually grow until we get to the completion of the project. So for today's video, it's just going to be really general. Um, I'm just going to show you, like basic stuff related to CSS just to help you understand how CSS would work and how you can utilize CSS uh, in your term projects. We started CSS, last time in class, and we did some work with it. So today, hopefully, we're just gonna solidify what we talked about earlier, and I'll be able to help those of you who have not done CSS before. So I actually just created the basic page index.html, and then I essentially have another file called style.css, which is currently empty. And then in my index.html, I just have a basic page. So I created, you know, maybe header, one tag, couple paragraphs, etc. And essentially, these two paragraphs, they have some content, and then I have another paragraph that's currently empty. So if I refresh the page, this is actually what I can see. I can view page source. There is not really much to it, so you can see exactly what I just created. So as we discussed in class, in order to link my page to an external CSS file, I need to use the link tag. And then the link tag takes a couple different attributes. The relation attribute, which is always style sheet, and then the href attribute, which works exactly similar to href in the a tag. And then essentially this is just going to point to the CSS file, which should be, kind of like typically in the root directory of the project. So in this case, it's style.css. So we're just going to start again really simple here, and then we're just going to move on. So I'm thinking all the CSS stuff is just going to be in one video. So I'm not sure how long this video will be. But again, we're not going to really go deep into it because this is just a database course. It's not really a web programming class. Okay. So now for style.css, let's say, and normally this is the way I like to do it, is kind of put border on different elements to see how things actually look like. So for instance, because I have, this is another page, index.html, I have h1 and p tags. So remember, CSS works this way. I have a selector, and then essentially you have a curly braces, and then you have property, and then you have value, and then you can obviously have any number of properties you want, and then whatever values for each property. So for my selector, it's just going to be, in this case, h1. Let's say I'm going to add border, 1 pixel solid black. So now you can see now I have, although this space I really haven't used in my application, but it's actually part of the scope or the space that is reserved for my h1 tag. I'm going to do the same thing for p this time. I'm just going to say border 1 pixel solid, let's say dashed in this case, dashed black as well. So this is actually the paragraph. Notice we also have another paragraph that is empty. That's why you can see the change, kind of like how it looks over there. So if I do a test, you can see test is over here. And that's why adding a border will really give you an idea of how your page looks like and essentially how different stuff are related. And remember when we discussed in class the fact that sometimes, the page is just going to be the width of the page is going to be reserved for different elements. So you might have your navigation, um, like div to the left, and then you would have some content, and then maybe you have the right, side of the page reserved for something else. And that's how this is going to be really helpful to you to understand how things are done. So now, to work with this, let's say for my paragraph, we can see the width is pretty much the entire width of the screen. I can change it. I can say width. I can specify this in pixels, but I also can specify this in some other values. So for instance, it could be, in percentage. So whatever original amount that is reserved for this element, do some percentage off of that amount. So let's say the width is 50%, for instance. So notice now it's just 50% of my paragraph. And then again, I think I showed you this in class, but if you change the size of your screen, and that's also helpful when it comes to you using different devices for testing, or people visiting your application from different devices. This should be really adaptive. So this is a relative measure, 50%, but you could also give static measure. For instance, in pixels, you can say, I'm gonna say, well, my paragraphs are gonna take 300 pixels. So if you visit from your phone or from your laptop, it's just gonna be 300 pixels. And that's not always good, because you don't know what device people will be using when they visit your app. So I'm just gonna say, for now, I'm just gonna say it's 50%. Now, there is one attribute called color. Color is just going to change your font color. So for instance, you can see over here, it tend to be red. Now, one thing I don't like about this is, the text is way too close to the border. And you can change that with an attribute called padding. So padding, essentially, there is, just going to control how far the text is from the border, kind of like internal border of the content. In this case, it's just a text. But, one thing with this one is, if you make it like just padding, if you say it's, for instance, like 10 pixels, now what's going to happen, it's going to apply, on the left border, top border, right border, and bottom border. But you can actually specify for padding left, top, bottom, or right if you want. But if you just make it really general like padding, it's just going to apply for different dimensions of the element. So if I refresh, you can see now it just applied. It doesn't matter to the right, because there's already a long space between the text and the right border. Now if you want, you can actually also, here is this. So, and I think we touched on this before, but let's say I want to change the background color on this element, but not this one. How would I do that? Because now, essentially, I just have a paragraph, and paragraph is just going to apply for all paragraphs in my page. So in order to do this, you need to actually add, different attributes for your tags. So for instance, if I give this paragraph an ID, and an ID is an attribute in which you would give a unique ID for that element. So now this element gets the ID first. So now when I go back to style, the selector in this case for the ID is normally with the pound and then the name of the ID. So in this case, it's just going to be first. And for this one, it's just going to be background color. Let's say it's going to be green. So now for this paragraph, essentially the rules that are going to apply on this paragraph are this one, because it's a paragraph, and this one because it has the ID first. Let's see what we get, and there you go. So now, essentially, this is what happened. If you know, actually VS Code, by the way, gives you this tool which allows you to pick like different colors. There's different models to choose different colors. There's like the RGB model, red, green, and blue. And if you want, it will actually really help you figure out exact color you want. But for the sake of this video, we're just gonna make it really, really simple. So for the other one, for instance, let's say I'm gonna give this another ID. So it's just gonna be like second, and I need to actually remove this sign. And then over here, what I'm gonna do is again, second. Let's say this one has a background color of yellow. And you know, here it is. Now, if I wanted, for instance, to change or to have this paragraph coming with different padding or different other values, I can actually change it in here. But obviously, it's a good practice to have common elements, have kind of like similar properties, because as you have multiple pages in your application will look consistent, and it's not going to be really, you know, like feeling not consistent for the user. You want to make sure you give the users the feeling that they could easily navigate through your application, and as they navigate going from one page to another, your application looks kind of similar and even behaves in similar ways. So one thing in here I also want to touch on is something called margin. So as we have just seen in padding, which controls the space between the element and its internal borders, margin actually controls the space between the element and other elements surrounding that element. So as of now, you can see there is a space between these two paragraphs. But what if I want to say, well, for you know, for instance, this paragraph with the ID first, I want to say the margin for it is actually 20. Let's actually make it bigger, 30 pixels. Let's see what happens. So you can see now this paragraph actually kind of like moved kind of like towards the right of the page, because this element essentially from the left, its parent element, if you looked into the HTML, is actually the body. And the body is essentially whatever you see inside of the whole page. So it's pretty much your browser window. So it made 30 pixels to the left, and then 30 pixels to the top, 30 pixels to the bottom, 30 pixels to the right. In this case, we did not really again need it because there's already so much space to the right of the element. If you want to actually increase that to something like, you know, make it, you know, like maybe let's say 90, just to increase the space, you can see now how actually the space even change more, and you can see kind of how the space is going. Now, one tool you can use in order, you know, to look into different elements and the spacing and things like that. Again, you don't really have to do it, but I personally use it, is if you use the inspector, which comes built in your browsers typically. For Google Chrome, I really like this one. So if I go, for instance, to, I think if you select it over here, so this is actually going to give you the option to select the element, and then as you hover over, the page is just going to change. And the one thing in particular in here is this is called the box model. So in the box model, again, as you hover over this model over here, you can see 10 under padding. And again, if you look into the CSS, we made the padding to be 10 pixels. And then the border is just 1 because, again, if you look into the CSS, the border says the width of that border is just 1 pixel. And you can see in here how many pixels it took. Margin is 9 pixels. And notice as you hover, the color is kind of, I don't know, it's like pinkish or something. It's 90 pixels, and you can see all the space that's assigned for the margin. Again, you don't really have to do it, but if you work in web development or if you worked before in web development, you probably have used this already. Now, normally, again, the margin works the same way padding would work. So there's margin left, margin top, margin bottom, margin right. If you just actually specify margin, it's just going to apply over the whole dimensions. Okay, so that's for my margin padding. I'm not sure if you guys can hear my baby crying outside. Sorry about that. So now let's actually do the same thing for my H1 in here. So now before we do this, some of the stuff I'm gonna be doing for the H1 is already kind of similar for my paragraphs. So we talked about the IDs, but there is also something you could do, which is actually like assigning classes for elements. Now the difference between classes and IDs is IDs are unique. So once you give an ID for an element, you typically don't give the same ID for another element. But for classes, different elements, and when I say elements, I mean HTML tags. So different elements could have the same class. So for instance, for my H1, I'm just going to give it a class called, for instance, yellow background, BG. What this is going to do is, different classes could get this, different elements could get the same class. So for now, for instance, I can say this, a new paragraph with the class yellow BG, and then let me just add test in here. So for now, I'm not going to really see any changes. Notice this paragraph already took the red font color, the background, the 1 pixel dash border. But now in my CSS, I'm actually going to choose this yellow background or specify the yellow background class, like its own yellow background color. So for IDs, you do the dash or you do the pound sign. For the class, it's typically dot and then class name. So it's going to be yellow BG, and then background color is yellow. Okay, so now if I refresh, notice how these two actually took that yellow background. Notice actually a couple different elements, not the same element, they got the same class, yellow BG, and that's perfectly fine. And that's the nice thing about adding classes for your elements. So, different selectors in CSS, they could come in so many different ways. So the selector we have made so far is really simple. So we have only chosen like an element and then pretty much work our way around it. One thing, actually, before we do that, so let me just change it somehow. So rather than yellow BG, let's actually make it like a blue BG for background color, and the blue BG. Now for my style, the CSS, it's gonna be the blue BG, color blue. So at least we kind of discriminate between all these different elements. Now, let's say I have a div now. So I'm just going to add one more div. Now, this div, I will have a paragraph, and then a paragraph inside a div. So let's see. This is actually my paragraph. Now, this paragraph, actually, again, it took all the rules we specified in this paragraph. But what if I want to style this paragraph a little differently? So this div, I will just give it ID, kind of like special div. And this paragraph, I don't really want to make the border dash. I just want to make it solid. And then I also don't want this paragraph to be colored red. I want to, change the color of the font. The way I would do this in CSS, it's just going to be exactly the same. Now, the only difference is just going to be the selector. So in order to do selection in this case, I'm just going to say, there are a couple different ways to do it. One is I can say, in this case, it's just going to work this way because I only have few elements. Div space P. So what this means is the paragraph that is inside of the div. In this case, we only have one paragraph inside the div, right? We don't have any other div. So it's going to work really fine in this case. So it will only apply for this paragraph in this case because it's the only paragraph inside of the div. And then I'm going to say border, let's say 2 pixel solid blue. And then color is just going to be yellow. So now see how it actually changed. It did not affect any other element. But again, when your page would grow, you will, very likely have another div somehow, and then some paragraphs inside, which will affect your, the look of your application. So I don't really recommend to do it that way, although you could for now. Now, instead of doing it this way, I'm just going to say, instead of this div, I'm just going to specify the ID, which is special div. So again, ID, it's bound, special div, and then paragraph. So notice it's exactly the same result. Okay, so so for now, this is how you would be able to do it. And remember, these rules would just apply to anything you have in your app. So even for table, table normally there's little padding, no padding pretty much, and then you can change the padding. That's the default that comes out of original HTML and CSS. Now, one thing I also want to talk about is, remember when you create an app, and then by default all the tags, they come pre-styled. So for instance, a paragraph is by default a block element, which means that every paragraph appears on its own line. You can change this default behavior by CSS. So for instance, I can say the paragraph, instead of appearing as a new line, I can say display inline. What this will do is it will make each paragraph appear as like an element, like an image, which is actually called inline in HTML. Notice in this case we just it doesn't really look that great because I think because of the width. So I think if we just remove it, test, where is that test? So if I actually remove this just for illustration, so here is actually these two paragraphs, and then like let's say you add some elements, or some content. So if I refresh, notice how this is gonna change, but still it doesn't really go to a new line. We're still inside of the same line inside of the browser window. You can do the same thing also for elements that inline, but actually you want them to be displayed separately on their own lines. So in that case, you would actually have something like display block. So the reverse of inline is block. So for instance, images, if you want images to be displayed on their own lines, you would actually specify display block for them. And now the nice thing about the CSS is, remember those pages, HTML pages, which you will have a lot in your application, they will only be linked to the same CSS file. So for instance, I just created another page called help.html. So now if I have, for instance, like a div and then inside paragraph, so thanks for contacting us. And then I go to that page, which is help. So as of now, I don't see any changes because this page doesn't link to style.css. So to link it, it's just again link relation style sheet. And then href is just going to be style.css. And you can see now the changes are there. So I think that should conclude the things we wanted to talk about. So selecting by tag, selecting by the class, and then selecting by ID. And then those are the important things I wanted to touch on. So color, background color, border, padding, margin, because I think that's what you guys are going to need for the most part for the project. Okay, so I hope that is helpful. In my next video, what I will do is we're going to start talking about PHP, and I will show you really a page that looks with .html extension. You can actually change the extension to PHP, but the page would still look the same. Now, one thing we're going to talk about as well is when we run PHP files, you cannot run them the way we run HTML files. You'd have to actually, because it's server side, so they have to run by a server, so we have to use XAMPP and put our files in certain places in order to get our files to display and work properly. The other thing, as I said, is I'll be posting this on GitHub in just a second, and then I'll post the link for you guys on YouTube in the description box. Okay, have a good day, guys, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.